Thank you. Yeah, hey everybody. I'm Parker, co-founder and oh yeah, thank you for the water. CTO of Caldera. We are a Rollups as a service platform. I know it's sort of like the hot thing these days to be working on, but that's what we do. We build rollups for folks. And the topic of my little talk is taking on-chain games to production with app rollups. And I think really the main idea here is that the company was founded about a year ago, and at the time it was not a consensus opinion that app rollups would be a thing. We were originally founded on the idea of actually on-chain games specifically. Not a lot of the sort of app chains that you see nowadays are on-chain games, but we were originally founded on the idea that if we look at a lot of the problems in the Ethereum ecosystem and what people are building that could be possible but isn't possible today, we just thought a lot of them were on-chain games, and that's why we started the company. We thought they were cool, we wanted to work on it, and so we started the company based around app rollups. So a little bit of history. I think everyone is relatively familiar with the sort of like progression of on-chain games, but we start with games like Dark Forest, like Curio, like Axie Infinity. Right? So these are early experiments in putting various amounts of gameplay and various bits of logic on-chain. Dark Forest in particular was an inspiration to us. We were part of the ETH University 0x Park crowd, and I think a lot of what we were inspired by was just the fact that you could do a lot more on-chain than what people had been doing previously. So Dark Forest, Curio, and Axie. Sort of three different approaches to gaming, right? Axie, as we all know, chucked a bunch of assets on-chain, settled on-chain, but ultimately I don't know if necessarily people consider it like an on-chain game to the same extent that people do these days. Curio and Dark Forest were other various like early experiments to chuck like large amounts of gameplay on-chain. And so basically in the process of doing this, we discovered that we had a lot of problems. One, insecure bridges. North Korea's out and about. You gotta be a little careful about your bridges, because they will kind of get you. But Dark Forest and Curio mostly taught us how expensive compute and storage was on modern blockchains, right? Dark Forest, which was originally deployed on a Gnosis chain, which is just some random chain which used like XDAI as like the custom gas token or the native gas token. And you ask the question, why was it deployed on Gnosis chain? And the answer goes something like, they needed somewhere to deploy it, and Ethereum was too expensive, but they wanted it to be public. So that's why they chose some random chain where there was no activity, where there was no usage, but where they could ultimately like host their game. And to us, this doesn't seem like the reasoning of where you would want to put a production system to secure money. It goes against a lot of the reasons why you would build like an on-chain game in crypto. And lastly, of course, just like non-performant blockchains. Right? We did Curio's V1, a game called Treaty, an RTS game, right? And we were doing this on like an Optimism V1 chain. It was incredibly slow. It crapped out with like 15 players, and we just found that it just didn't really work that well. And Curio took away their own lessons from it. I'll talk about what they're building later, and obviously Kevin from Curio talked earlier, and I'm sure he can talk more about the infrastructure that they're building. But the main lesson for us here was that there are like a shit ton of problems with like building production systems, right? Where we were a year ago, the question is like, how do we get these games to production? How do we get them to secure real value? How can we build like a compelling user experience? And it just seems that we have like so many different problems, right? A lot of these problems are not ours to solve. We are a rollups as a service. We do the rollups. We do the infrastructure. A lot of the problems are, there for on-chain games to solve, not necessarily us. But where can we specifically solve problems? I would highlight one, security. As we know with Ronin, the Axie chain, the chain was actually hacked because some North Korean dudes like compromised their like key management service. From what I hear, like you don't want to just have like a 5 of 9 validator set for your bridge. It turns out that's pretty bad, and the North Koreans are pretty good at hacking stuff. So you got to be careful. And so basically what I'm trying to do is motivate a lot of the reasons why we thought that app rollups made a lot of sense for on-chain games in production. So today, right, we are chucking various amounts of gameplay and economics on-chain, right? I'm not here to necessarily give a survey of what people are doing on-chain, but just highlighting these two factors is like either game logic or game economies. And this can be sort of like a spectrum of things. There are many crypto games which chuck various amounts of their game economy on-chain with like various NFT contracts, staking mechanisms, pools, that sort of stuff. And then there are also games that chuck game logic on-chain, game state and game logic, of course. And there's a sort of spectrum here, and I would say that gameplay and economics are sort of orthogonal axes as well, where you can have game with a lot of like gameplay on-chain, but not so much in the economics category, and of course vice versa. So today we are talking about app rollups and why they make sense for on-chain games, but I also want to bring up this core question of, I think, app rollups versus alternatives. Should I put my on-chain game on an app rollup, or should I put it on like a monolithic chain like Solana, Sui, or Aptos? Or should I do like an app chain? So not necessarily like an app rollup, but an app chain. And I want to dive into this a little bit more. And I think a lot of the core thinking around my talk revolves around this point of like, when does like an app rollup make sense? And what are the sort of trade-offs that you incur when you do like an app rollup versus one of these other things? And for the record, I'm actually quite bullish on like Solana, Aptos, and Sui. Or not Aptos and Sui, sorry, those are kind of like not that great. But Solana in particular is actually like pretty cool, right? There's this dude I follow on Twitter called like Mert. And every time someone goes, hey, the Solana ecosystem is dying, he goes, look at Helium, look at Visa, look how great the tech is. And I think it's very reactionary, but I also think it's true in that Solana is a shared state machine, which is like blazing fast, very, very cheap, and can push the boundaries of what you can do on-chain, right? It ticks a lot of the boxes as to on-chain games, right? Performance, I think the developer UX is pretty crappy, but it does tick a lot of the boxes as to where you would chuck your on-chain game. And also there's the option of like Cosmos chains. I think this is also a relatively compelling option. Although, you know, the Cosmos ecosystem has a lot of drama, it has a lot of issues, but ultimately the fundamentals from first principles of how do I build a performant game, how do I build a performant execution environment, which ticks the boxes of good bridges, cheap compute and storage, as well as performance optimized. You can do all of these things on a Cosmos chain. And so you wonder, like, what is fundamentally the trade-off when you move to an app rollup? Right? What is the difference at a very fundamental level between a rollup and app chains or monolithic chains? And the answer is that when you build an app chain, you're constraining yourself to settle on Ethereum or some other blockchain. You're constraining the design of your blockchain to be so that you rely on another blockchain for security. And this, to some extent, constrains the design space. There are some nice properties. For example, with an app rollup, you only have to have like one sequencer, which allows you to achieve like lower latency and possibly higher performance for the same amount of security decentralization. I think this is pretty great. But I think you can also achieve some of these properties on monolithic chains or Cosmos app chains. Right? I think that truly speaking from first principles, that Cosmos app chains and monolithic optimized chains are great solutions. Like I think there are many cases in which you would want to build your on-chain game on Solana, Aptos, or Sui. But I think the core point as to why you would choose an app rollup is very, very fundamentally and very, very simply that an app rollup is a bet on the Ethereum ecosystem. And this is pretty much the only reason why you would use an app chain. Maybe there's some more. I can talk about that more. I don't necessarily want to undermine my own company and my own point here. But I think that very, very fundamentally, the main point of an app chain, or an app rollup, I mean, is that you're betting on the strength of the Ethereum ecosystem and not necessarily other things. Right? As a game developer, you have a trade-off to make in that, do I want to optimize for building a great game with great UX, or do I want to optimize for like ecosystem or go-to-market or things like that? And you know, I don't necessarily want to present like a false dichotomy in that you can have it both ways, obviously if you just do like a good job. But I want to just emphasize that like when you choose an app rollup, you're betting on Ethereum. And you can sort of like go, maybe this is short-sighted, right? there are a lot of, it's a bear market, so obviously Ethereum is doing well, but there are a lot of situations in which you can see like Solana, Aptos, Sui doing okay as well in the future. Maybe not Aptos, I don't really like Aptos, but Sui and Solana in particular could be really, really good down the road. Cosmos chains also have a lot of potential, right? It's great technology, IBC, that's fantastic. People are building genuinely innovative things on Cosmos chains. But just going back to the fundamental point, right? If you're an app developer right now in this market, and even in the future, when you project the trajectories of the Ethereum ecosystem against all these other ones, I'm betting on Ethereum over these other ones. And that's, I think, just the fundamental way I think about things at the end of the day, and I don't know if there's necessarily getting around that if you disagree. So moving on to a couple sort of like concrete examples of where we are nowadays is that there's this game called Primodium that we're hosting, right? So I talked about all of the problems that we had of compute and storage. I talked about bridges. So we are in testnet phase with a lot of on-chain games. I think a lot of on-chain games are in testnet and development, reaching mainnet hopefully sometime next year. Apparently there's this one called Primodium. I think it's my duty to shill it a little bit. There's this guy called Victor that I know, and he tells me that it's like the best on-chain game that he's ever played. Apparently he stayed up all night playing it, which is pretty cool. You guys should check it out if you haven't already. It's based on like the Lattice Mud indexer. Also a great team, working on some great infrastructure there. But you guys should check this out. And then on the opposite side is things like in-game economies, right? So I talked about gameplay on-chain, but there's also sort of things like chucking as much of economic activity on-chain as possible, right? It's like, if you take a broader view of gamification, there's also not just like core gameplay loops, but also the sort of like meta game. A lot of people talk about like in mobile free-to-play, it's less about, oh, you don't have to have good gameplay anymore. It's about like nailing that meta game with like loot boxes, like the sort of like structure of the game to get like the gamer like hooked on like what you're doing to encourage like real world economic activity. So I wanted to highlight like the work that Crypto Unicorns as well as Moonstream is doing in chucking a lot of their activity on chain. And I think that if you are a game that is putting a lot of your economics on chain, maybe an app rollup is not necessarily the right solution for you. Maybe it is. I think the main thing there is just, the thinking there is just around cost and gas, rather than necessarily like optimizing like performance. And to some extent this can make sense, to some extent it won't. As well as I guess like value capture. I sort of glossed over this point earlier, but I think the other main reason why you would choose an app chain at all over a monolithic chain is obviously just like value capture for your chain, for your token, sequencer fees, sequencer revenue, that sort of thing. So just brushing up on like the future, and I want to keep this relatively narrow in that I'm going to talk about like the future of app rollups, not necessarily the future of on-chain games. But here are the problems that we're tackling when it comes to app rollups and on-chain games. One, dedicated execution engines. Argus and Curio are fantastic sort of offerings. I know Argus is not an app rollup, but I'm still quite bullish on Scott as well as the team there. I think they know what they're doing, although I'm not as personally bullish on, on the Cosmos ecosystem. Curio, of course, is building their Keystone execution engine. Yeah, thanks. All right, sorry, good stuff. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity to build out like an app rollup. Obviously problems with interoperability and lowering costs. These things are just gonna go down. Just take my word for it, it's gonna happen. Probably gonna be good. If there are problems in the short term, I think that they'll be solved within the next 1 or 2 years, and that's why I think, at least in the medium term, app rollups are probably the most compelling option to actually get to a production system with on-chain games, right? We have been in testnet phase for ages, and I think that in order to realistically get to a spot where we can secure real-world assets in on-chain games, it's probably going to be an app rollup. Thank you.